Hi, this is Misha, and yet again I'm back with more Mosins. This is the Finn Rifles Part 3, but at least we're breaking up the mix a little bit. This episode is primarily going to be dedicated to everyone's probably favorite and probably de facto best. This is the Finn M39, and this is Finland pretty much taking the Mosin as far as it can go. But we're going to be talking a lot about World War II, which in Finland was first the Winter War, and then later the Continuation War, both fought against Russia. And in that war, a good number of M91 30s were captured, and even some made in Finland, at least barrels. So we got to talk about those. And because we've been doing this in threes, our final gun on the table is a German Mauser. This is a Karabiner 98a. And of course, this one's an 8mm, not 7.62 54R. And we'll kind of get into why this is here. Alrighty. If you have not watched the first couple of episodes, it'd be a good idea to do it, because that's going to inform where this guy came from. If you have, well, as you know, the Army wasn't particularly satisfied with the M27, even after implementing some upgrades. They still weren't completely happy. In fact, as early as 1935, AV-1 was ordered to kind of look at all the potential proposed changes to the M27, take those, and make a whole new rifle. The Civil Guard, in turn, had upgraded its M2830 and was actually very happy with it. But many in both branches, not to mention the government at large, realized that having two separate procurement design, two separate rifles with supply chains was not desirable. It makes perfect sense why they would want to have a unified rifle that would be used by both branches. And to that result, a committee was established with people from both, and obviously designs would come from both. And that's actually why we have the Mauser on the table. After World War I, as I said in episode 1, Finland had a hodgepodge of weapons, including a number of Mausers. They had purchased about 4,000 Kar.98as from France in 1919. This is really, it's a short rifle, although you can call it a carbine. It's got a 23¼ inch barrel. We see this front sight protector, which looks like a small version of the Finn, honestly. Full-length handguard. Typical side sling mounts. We've got this turned-down bolt handle that's kind of a half-globe shape with checkering on the bottom. We've got the typical Mauser wing style safety. You know the drill. And they would issue these to cavalry as well as artillery crews, some coastal battery soldiers, and anti-aircraft. Basically someone needing a more light portable gun. Now, these were not really in service for all that long in Finland. They started to be sold off, and actually many were traded to Poland in the 1920s for more Mosins, but for a time this was the standard for the cavalry. And I bring this up because this greatly influenced a version of the M27 that I wish I had, and I bet most Finn collectors wish they had, the M27 RV, the cavalry short rifle. The M27 RV was based on the Mosin, was based on the M27, but it had a shorter 20.5-inch barrel, and it took some cues from this gun here. It had the turn down bolt handle style with even with the check ring on the bottom. Of course, it had the front sight protector, as the M27 did, and it had side sling mounts inspired by this guy. So you can really see this gun, how it led them to make the M27 RV. Even this wing safety, the Civil Guard actually played with this on some prototypes in the early 1930s, although they never went much of anywhere. It's kind of interesting, so that's why I brought it out. Since I couldn't show you an RV, I thought I'd at least show you a little carbine that was in use. And the reason I bring this up in this video, what AV1 came up with was the M35 or M91 35. This was a short rifle based on the M27 RV, but with many improvements. Now, the M27 RV was a very small production gun. They only started making them in 1933, and they were already out of production by 1935. They only built a little over 2,200, and because they were issued to units that saw heavy fighting in both wars, only about 300 were in good, usable shape after 1944. So very few exist in the world today, even fewer in usable condition. Still a very interesting gun, and kind of the pride of any Finn collection. I know there are a few out there, guys, but they're not common. But that did lead to the M35 prototype. And this is what the Army brought to the table when they were looking at the new service rifle. They basically took the M35, they liked it short, length, lighter weight, and they combined it with a modified version of the M2830's rear sight. They liked the new rear sight that the Civil Guard had developed, but they thought it was a little too finely adjustable, and so they made it a little beefier, a little less precise, but also a little easier to use in the field. They put this on a short carbine, and this is what they proposed. The Civil Guard, on the other hand, really thought the M2830, after all their work, was the way to go, was superior. They didn't like that the M35 had such large muzzle blast, concussion, felt recoil, and they really didn't like that it wasn't accurate enough for their taste. They were really into long-range marksmanship. This kind of left them in a deadlock for a number of years. And this is really why the M39 wasn't ready. Finally, in 1939, and around April of that year, the Army more or less acquiesced and essentially agreed to adopt an upgraded version of the M2830, mainly with the differences in the stock and all that. With a little more tinkering, this became this rifle here, the M39. So we really have changed. Now let's talk about what's similar. We have a heavy barrel, at least heavier than standard Mosin, but we have slimmed it down just a little bit. This was both to save on metal, also a little bit on weight, but we're still at 26 inches with the adjustable front sight. We have basically an M2830 rear sight. The only difference, they've added a shorter 150 meter battle setting. Otherwise, it's pretty well the same. We take the same bayonet lug that we've been using since the M27 that takes the Puko type blade bayonet. The nose cap's interesting. It's actually a hybrid. It is hinged. Here, flip it over. Doot. Like the M27, but it doesn't need the popsicles because it also is the single piece design. I'm going to point this at you. Like the M2830, so it's a single piece up front here, better supported. So it's kind of a combination of both. We are going to a new pattern of cleaning rod, more Mauser style. A lot of older guns would receive this. Basically, they would make a couple of different links depending on the gun, and a lot of older guns would receive this new pattern to make it a standard with the large slot there. We've gone to a two-piece stock still, but it's a much heavier construction, pretty much all new. The front's heavier. We have a new upper handguard, beefier. The rear, quite distinctively, has this semi-pistol grip, very similar to what's on this 98A. So that's a new upgrade, kind of taken from the M35. The bolt, as usual, is the just a polished, upgraded Mosin bolt. Triggers again receiving that spring and has been smoothed out. The interrupter is an improved model, again to help prevent double feeds. This wood would be mostly Arctic birch, which wasn't known for warping. We're going to a whole new pattern of barrel band. It's moved further forward, it's not back here anymore. It has both sling swivels, as you see. They're pretty small, only about an inch wide, but we have side and bottom. In the back we have a small bottom swivel, but we have this cut out in the stock, inletted for the side. The idea was infantry would use the bottom slings, swivels, and cavalry, artillery crews could use the side to sling it across their back. So you get a lot of new parts here. In fact, we've got a new barrel, new furniture set, new barrel bands, new end cap, new rear sight. Really, we're only using modified Mosin bolts. We're still using original hex receivers. We're using modified trigger boxes and magazines and highly modified trigger groups. So the translation is the factories, SAKO and Tikkakoski, had to make a lot of new parts, and this delayed manufacture. They just had to tool up and they weren't really prepared. As a result, this wasn't ready for the winter war. I think only like 10 or 12 M39s had actually been completed by November when Russia invaded. So that's why in the earlier videos I said things like the M91 as well as the M27 and M2830 were kept in production a year or two longer than initially planned because they needed guns and they were set up to make them. The M39, first the Army would order 20,000 from SAKO in 1940. They would order another 40,000 in 42 and 43. And SAKO would build about 66,500 for them during that war. For their own civil guard, they would actually order about 21,000, but they would only receive about 10,000. The Army was taking priority. Anyway, in 1942, most civil guard rifles were turned over to the Army to kind of pool resources, and in fact, the civil guard itself was disbanded at the end of 1944. VKT also began manufacturing these during the continuation war period. They would make about 30,000 during that war. So a little under 97,000 were created from 1940 to 1944. A few more were put together in 1945. All told, they would build about 102,000 of these, including post-war assemblies. Now, SAKO would build these completely in-house. The VKT actions would actually be assembled into final guns at AV1 or AV3. Those were the majority. A few older Belgian barrels would be used, as well as a few barrels from Tikkakoski. But we're talking pretty small numbers, about 10,000 at most of the Belgian and maybe 5,000 at most of the Tikkakoski. And the Tikka barrels were mostly only used for repair or replacement of older worn out barrels from fighting. These guns were really liked. Okay, we're not really a lot, we're the same length as earlier guns, honestly a little bit heavier because of the beefier furniture, even if the barrel's a little bit lighter. But they worked. They had the accuracy of the M2830. They had the durability that the Army wanted. They didn't have excessive flash or recoil. They handled the 66 grain Finnish 7.62-54R, or sometimes they called it 7.62-53R cartridges very well. In fact, they quickly earned the nickname of Old Man Pekka after the Finnish president. You always know a gun is popular when it gets a nickname. I mean, look at the M28 and M2830. I don't know that the M27 had much of a nickname, at least not one that was repeatable. It really was the ultimate culmination of the Mosin-Nagants system. Again, the whole front end is all new. This pistol grip stock is fantastic. The triggers on these are very good. Accuracy was as good as you're going to get. They were very well done rifles. That's when they wanted as many as they could get during the continuation war. These would very much stay in service after the war. In fact, they were Finland's frontline rifle for another 2 decades. They did not start to be phased out until the 1960s. Even then, they were kept in reserve and second-line service through the 70s and into the 80s, and most were not even sold off as surplus until the 1990s and even into the 2000s, which is how many of them came over here. After the wars, Finland did a lot of inventory taking, and they found that they had about 78,000 of these left. Then they threw a few more together from parts, so it was around 80,000 in usable condition. So while some were definitely lost during combat or rebuilt, a large number did survive, certainly more than some of the older guns. I don't know what else to say about this. Most of you who own one know what I can say, and those who don't, you just need to go grab one and shoot it for yourself. It definitely shows that the Mosin system, the Mosin-Nagant, isn't inherently flawed, that it can be tuned. But what's nice, even though this is very accurate, it still doesn't sacrifice reliability. If anything, it's even more reliable than a Russian gun. Of course, the trade-off is they cost more to manufacture and they were made in much smaller numbers, but that's what Finland needed. They didn't have a huge armed forces, later to be the Finnish Defense Forces. They needed good rifles for their soldiers. That's not to say that these did not serve alongside things like the M91, M27, M2830. Obviously it did, but this became increasingly the frontline weapon as 42, 43 rolled on. About 1944 was a very common sight. So it was late to the party, but at least when it came, it really did satisfy both the Army and the Civil Guard, and it was a very good replacement for both guns and lived up. There were no major flaws or faults, and there weren't a lot of changes. The only one to really point out, this semi-pistol grip stock was planned from the get-go, but the first few thousand SAKO guns came out with straight stocks just because that's what SAKO had. They didn't have the blanks, or they weren't set up to cut the semi-pistol grip yet. So the early 1940 guns could have straight stocks, but most of these straight stocks were replaced in post-war refurbishment, much like this gun. I mean, this was a World War II gun that was refurbished afterwards, because pretty much all of these barrels and guns were put together between 40 and 44. A few more, like 6,000 and 45. There are some undated guns, and there are some 60s and early 70s dated barrels, but these seem to be older barrels that were just dated for when they were assembled by unit armorers, for mostly target practice, training, or competition shooting. So the military production pretty much was in the 1940s. One thing they never did get rid of, though, this ridiculous Mosin safety. Doesn't really seem to have been a priority. With all the other things they upgraded, they definitely were focused more on the sights and stock. Moving on, we're going to talk about Finland's use of the M9130, because it's kind of interesting. While the M39 was coming into production and thus frontline use at the beginning of the continuation war, 1941, Finland also considered manufacturing barrels and thus kind of reassembling its own 9130s that year, although it didn't at the time. It had captured about 25,000 9130s during the Winter War, 1939 to 1940, and over the course of the Continuation War, it would capture about another 100,000. In addition, it would get some from Bulgaria, and it would get a large batch of various Mosins from Germany in 1944, about 57,000 total, some of them being 9130s, mostly what Germany had picked up while fighting with the Soviet Union. Many of these were in pretty rough shape, but the receivers were usable, and some had okay bores. At the very beginning of the video, I showed you this. This is a typical Russian 9130. This is actually a so-called x-Dragoon made in 1927. And a rifle like this would have gone into Finland during the Winter War and could have very well been captured. This one was not. It's just a standard gun. But you'll see quite a few just standard 9130s with the SA in the box stamped on them. Now what that is, that's a Finnish military property marking. In 1942, the Finnish military discovered, the Finnish Army, Civil Guard discovered, that a lot of guns were unaccounted for. They were walking home or being kind of cached away, and they had really no property marks to prove because a lot of the guns had been privately owned, especially the Civil Guard rifles. They started putting property marks. The original property mark was actually a very long phrase that stretched the entire shank in Finnish. I'm not even going to attempt to repeat it here, sorry guys. But Finnish collectors know what I'm talking about. They are very rare. They were only used in 1942 and only for a few months, 4 or 5, maybe 6 months. Then they quickly went to the more familiar SA in a box, which basically just stood for Finnish Army. And the SA in the box would be used for many years and it would be put on many rifles after the fact. And they would just issue, or I should say probably reissue, many 9130s throughout the Continuation War. But, as Finland was wont to do, if a rifle was damaged, they would rework it. Here's one here. This retains its original, if you can see here, Tula 1939 barrel, so they didn't rebarrel it, but they did reissue it. It has the SA. And they did restock it. This is a heavier stock. You can see in the back at the butt plate where the stock is a little thicker than the butt plate there. Also, it has a pot belly up here where it's heavier. And it has the wire sling swivels like you saw in video 1 in the 91. Some reissued guns would have these, others would not. So a lot of these restocked guns would be issued, and if the barrels were in good shape, they would leave the barrels on. And a lot of the times they would use the same 9130 front sight. Even on rifles they built, because they had a lot of these, but not always. They would also sometimes shove Finnish cleaning rods in here, although this one still has the original Russian type. You know, so there's lots of variation. And this became a very kind of de facto standard gun in Finland, because they were basically free. And a lot of these were used to replace things like the Karkano, kind of non-standard guns, like the Karkano M38. That means a lot of these ended up in the hands of artillery crews and coastal batteries and so on and so forth. Obviously, the 9130 in Finnish use was the same length. It's about 48.5 inches overall. We've got about a 28.5-inch barrel, so it's about 2 inches longer than the M27, M28, M39, but it's still about 3 inches shorter than the original 1891 Mosin or M91 Mosin. The story doesn't end there, though. Not at all. Then we get to this rifle here. If you look here on the receiver, or barrel shank I should say, this is a fully reworked, basically Finnish production 9130. While they considered making the 9130 in 1941, they didn't really do much until 1943. At this time, Tikkakoski started making Finnish production 9130 barrels, so the 28.5-inch barrel. Now, interestingly, these barrels weren't made heavier. They were just standard barrels, basically, just made in Finland. Now, at this time, VKT and SAKO were doing the 91 and the M39, so Tikkakoski started doing some 9130s. Very interesting that they would do this, to make this choice to go with this when they had several other guns, but I guess because they had receivers, why not? Now, a lot of these would actually be on hex receivers, but as you see, some could also be on round. They would restock these too, with the heavier stock, sling swivels. So one change they would make, at least on some of the Finnish assembled 9130s, they would replace the front globe sight from the 9130 with a blade from the 91. Now, because of different sight heights, they actually had to put a little spacer down here, if you can see. It's dovetailed at the bottom to fit into the barrel, and then it has a second dovetail at the top to fit the sight. Not really sure why they did this. It seems like, I guess machining wise, it's maybe a little simpler, but they had a lot of the globe sights, so why they didn't just use those, I'm not sure. I guess they preferred the blade, but this seems like it's a little more delicate. It's not protected, and you have two dovetails to worry about coming loose instead of one, and of course your sight's just that much higher and off the barrel, but oh well, that's what they did. But not all. There's plenty of guns with the Tikkakoski barrel that have the globe front sight too. 1943 and 1944, Tikka would make about 14,000 9130 barrels, and of these, the AV3 arsenal would take about 5,000 and have them assembled into complete working rifles by the end of the Continuation War in 1944. So not a large number. While the 9130 was used in Finland, it was mostly ones with the original Russian barrels. Not very many actually got to the field with the Finnish-made barrels before the end of the war. It's also kind of interesting that the rejection rate at Tikka for the 9130 barrel was notably higher than other times and places. Many more than 14,000 barrels were actually made, but several thousand were rejected for whatever reason. Anyway, the story of the 9130 in Finland continues after the war. Another 7,000 to 8,000, including this rifle here, I'm sure, were assembled using wartime barrels, meaning we have about 11,000 or 12,000 total, and there were still about 1,000 to 2,000 leftover barrels, virgin barrels, that weren't used and actually still pop up in Finland to this day. I thought it was worth mentioning that this was a kind of a de facto or substitute standard rifle in Finland during World War II period. And it's not at all uncommon to even find just otherwise Russian guns with the SA in the box marking. And that is pretty well it. That gets us through all of the Finnish Mosins of note. This is not the end of the series, but this is kind of the end of all the new Mosins. Just thought we'd show them here. If you have any questions or comments, as always, we really welcome them below. And if you have not checked out the first couple of parts, we'd appreciate it if you do so. And also, please tune in again soon for the next part. We'll get into more modern guns. If you liked the video, please click like. And if you'd really like to support the channel, please, check out the link to our Patreon page. Every dollar counts, and we really appreciate it. Well, this is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.